Welcome everybody to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and this week we're doing two episodes actually. This is the first of two. We're doing a mini episode, a Baldur's Gate Alchemy update. So, for those who haven't heard the news, we actually got a update for Baldur's Gate, a Alchemy update. I didn't actually think they were going to do this, but they did edit / buff / nerf about 25 cards, I think. Their overall goal, was to make the aggressive decks a little bit less good and to make dragons specifically a little better. I'm not sure how well they accomplished their goal, but that was their goal. And so we're going to talk about it today. We're going to talk about every card that got changed, some of the implications of those changes, some format implications as a whole. I've got in about, I think, 7 drafts so far, either from myself playing or from coaching sessions so far. So I do have some experience with the format. And yeah, let's dive into it. Of course, before we do, I want to shout out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. You can go there if you like the show and you want to support what we are doing here. There's a bunch of awesome reward tiers over there for any tier you want to sign up for. Awesome rewards that we give back to you. And yeah, I just want to say, really appreciate all the support everybody gives each week. Helps the show keep on going, and I want to keep it short and sweet and just dive in. So, let's just start talking about the cards. I've got kind of like a rough order here, sort of order of importance, sort of in color. But I want to start with one of the most impactful changes, which I think is Circle of the Land Druid. So Circle of the Land Druid is the 1 and a green 2/1 common that when it enters the battlefield, you mill 4 cards, and then when it dies, you return a land from your graveyard back to your hand. So this was a 1/1 before, and as a 1/1, it kind of wasn't much of a card, and all of the value of this card was how much you cared about filling your grave and how easy it was to sacrifice this for value, and maybe you got a block in to get a land back. And that's like a little bit too mopey, basically. As a 2/1, that changes the card quite a bit because now it is much easier to engineer a 2-for-1 in some way. Making a block will kill your opponent's 2-drop or 3-drop. You get your land back. It almost plays like Guildsworn Prowler on offense as well, which we'll get to that card in a second. But they nerfed that card. Circle of the Land Druid kind of stole that card's power. But it'll almost play in a way where you attack with this on turn 2, if you want to, or sorry, on turn 3. They probably won't want to block it because you get a land back at that point, and they don't really know how valuable that is to you. Maybe you're missing your land drop. It'll probably be valuable to you in some regard. So not only is the card a lot better, just giving that extra point of power, but it does give green a 2-drop that you actually want to play. There was Basilisk, right? The Underdark Basilisk, the 1/2 Death Touch, and the Knoll Hunter, which was whatever, right? The 2-mana 2/2, you didn't really care about the Pack Tactics trigger, puts a counter on it. Now green actually gets a quality, really good 2-drop. So this is an awesome card. I think this is, so if I'm talking green common power ranking, Underseller Myconid is definitely better still, right? Still the top common. And I'm going to talk about Myconid a little more in depth later because I think that is another huge winner of this update. Past that, I think Dread Linarm comes in still at number 2 as just such a quality top-end threat. But I think Circle of the Land Druid is number 3 on the list now, above Owlbear, above Herdgorger, right? Above these the other green ramp targets at common. I would play, as many of these as I can get, I think. Of course, this also has the may technology in the wording here. It says you may mill 4 cards, so it's not like you're going to mill out if you have too many of these. And I think this card alone not only makes the green decks a lot better, and I liked them in the first place, but also makes any of the kind of dorky self-mill synergies that weren't really present in the pre-update version of this format a lot more enticing. And kind of the finicky stuff like Summon Undead, or even some of the other payoffs for the green-black graveyard deck do get a little bit better now that this card is a playable card, because it's just such a good, a quality card and a good synergy piece. So keep your eye out for this one. I like it a lot, and yeah, let's move on. Next up, related. So we've got Druidic Ritual and Split the Spoils. These are 2 cards that got buffed, both, on the card text of these cards, but also because Circle of the Land Druid got buffed, we kind of have some symbiosis here in a way. So Druidic Ritual, 2 and a green sorcery, you can mill 3 cards, then return up to 2 creature and or land cards from your graveyard to your hand. So this used to be, you can only choose a 1 creature, 1 land. Now you can choose 2 creatures if you'd like later in the game, which is a I think a buff, but not, it doesn't change fundamentally how I view the card. This is a card that I wasn't all that interested in my green decks in the first place, because a lot of times my green decks operated in a way where even if they were trying to play this like long game, it wasn't a long game where it was about like recursion and grinding. It's kind of this long game where you're like sitting back a little bit or maybe proactively ramping, and then you just kill them with a Dread Lunarm pretty quickly. So this isn't going to be like a key part of the decks, the green decks, I don't think. I do think that there is room for this card to shine though, where you could have a, like I was talking about before, a green-black deck that maybe was a bit grindier, relied a little bit more on removal, relied a little bit less on ramping, and this card could shine where you're actually attritioning them out instead of ramping them. Like, we kind of have two separate decks here. An attrition-y green deck, green-black deck, and a rampy green-black deck. And the rampy green-black deck, when I'm just playing like, or just green-base deck in general, I'm playing like, 5-6 top-end threats. I don't really care about messing around with this kind of grindy card that much. In the other decks, I definitely will. And another supplementary card here, Split the Spoils, 1 and a green sorcery, exile up to 5 target permanent cards from your graveyard, separate them into 2 piles. An opponent chooses one of those piles, you put that pile in your hand and the other cards in the graveyard. Very similar card. I think, again, this benefits a lot from Circle of the Land Druid, because I'm more willing to play that card. I'm going to play, multiples now, where before I'd maybe play a copy. So you do fill your graveyard pretty quickly. I guess big picture here, I can imagine a deck where you do have, 7, 8, 9 cards that self-mill. And if you go just Circle of the Land Druid into maybe another Circle of the Land Druid or a Druidic Ritual early in the game, Split the Spoils is going to turn on very, very quickly and is going to be good card selection and card advantage. Like, you take a mana off this card, it means that on turn 5, if your graveyard is stocked, you can play this and play a 3-drop you got back, right? So these cards do kind of play in the same space. Again, I think this kind of opens up a new deck rather than buffs a previously existing deck, because I just was never playing green-black as a graveyard deck. I was just playing green as a ramp deck, and I think now we've got this package of the graveyard stuff going on. Okay, next up we've got Emerald Dragon. So this is one that, I don't know, I was talking a little bit before, I alluded to, they tried to buff the dragon decks, and I don't want to say they buff them in the wrong way, because it is hard, just a little insight into buffing and nerfing and game design. It's really difficult to, you can have goals in mind of, let's say your goal was to buff the dragon deck, right? Like their goal was, they stated their goal was. The best way to do that is come up with new cards completely, and they can't really do that. Like, they could change Emerald Dragon, for example, into a completely different card with different text. I don't think people would like that very much. I think you have to kind of just like turn the dials a little bit on cards, like make it resemble what it looked like before. And I think what the dragon decks really needed was a complete overhaul, because they just kind of don't work very well unless you have like a rare payoff. So I'm going to go over a lot of these dragon payoffs, and most of them I'm going to say, yeah, this doesn't matter that much. And Emerald Dragon definitely falls into that category. So this is the 6 mana 4 green dragon with the Dissonant Wave adventure that counters a triggered ability. Doesn't matter very much. The difference here is this now has Ward 2. So it's a 6 mana 4/4 flyer with Ward 2. Doesn't matter that much. This card's problem wasn't that, like, you tapped out for your 6-drop and it died. I mean, that was some of the problem, but mostly it's that you're playing a 6 mana 4/4 flyer, and that just doesn't matter that much. So I'm gonna, breeze through the ones that don't matter that much, or that I don't think that matter that much. I just wanted to, prime us for those as we go forward. Ones that do matter, we've got some nerfs here. So that was the green cards. Going to the white cards here. Steadfast Unicorn is now a 1 mana 1/2. That's the same. The pump ability is 5 mana now. So 5 mana creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain vigilance. Activate only on your turn. So this is a pretty big nerf. Steadfast Unicorn was the 4th or 3rd best common before. Better than all of the white 2-drops like Soldier of the Watch, Steadfast Paladin, Dustguard. I would play 3 copies of the card before. I think now I'm going to be playing 1, maybe 2. And I think it is clearly worse than the white 2-drops now. So a lot of what made this card good was the fact that the numbers lined up in a way in the format where on turn 4, if you had this card on the battlefield, you could often push through a lot of damage because of threat of activation, where your early creatures could attack into your opponent's early creatures. You didn't actually have to activate the unicorn, and they just couldn't block because they wouldn't have good blocks because on turn 4 you had the ability up. I think pushing that back a turn changes this card enough that you're basically only going to be using this card once you have like played out your hand and you're like, okay, like now this is my way to push through damage on a kind of gummed up board, which is a fine thing still. I think you still want the card in your deck. The 1/2 body is still pretty serviceable in the format. Pecks in, goes, can double block if you need to, but you're never going to be able to activate this twice, or at least very rarely. Not, never say never, but a lot of the time with Unicorn, the previous Unicorn, you did activate it twice on turn 8 with 8 lands, and I don't think that's going to happen that much anymore, unless you have a bunch of Underseller Myconids, which then it might happen. That's still a nice little combo. Bit of a debuff here. I would still call this card a good playable, but I'm not excited about it anymore, I guess I would say. Blessed Hippogriff. So this is the 3-mana 2/3 flyer. When it attacks, something gets flying, and it's got the instant side. Target creature gets indestructible. The change here is the instant is now 2 mana instead of 1. I think this change is pretty small. I think the Blessed Hippogriff is still awesome. Probably not, top tier, best common on 17 lands anymore. But I still think I'm going to be picking it approximately where I did before, if I am in a white deck, which is maybe a good distinction to make, because I think the format has shifted a little bit, not to jump too far forward. I think the format has shifted a little bit where the white aggro decks are not the best thing to be doing by a lot anymore. I think that green ramp decks are quite good now. And before it would be like, oh yeah, I first pick Hippogriff because it's an awesome card. Not that I'm not going to do that sometimes. I feel like it will. But I'm not going to take this card and be like, oh yeah, we're really doing it, So this change is meaningful, but it doesn't affect my opinion of the card that much. What affects my opinion of the card is more format positioning, and then I think that white aggressive decks are just a little bit worse in general. Moving on to blue cards, Dragonborn Looter is the first one up. So this is the 2-mana 1/2 that you can tap in and pay 1 to draw a card, discard a card. It is now a 1-mana 1/2. This is a big buff. I think it is a subtle buff, and I think it maybe is not as obvious that this card has gotten a lot better, but it really has. So the problem with this card before is if you wanted to activate it any time before turn 7 and where the board is stalled out, it takes up part of your turn. It puts you a turn behind almost, right? You want to activate this on turn 3 after you've played it on 2. Well, now you can only play a 2-drop, and you just the blue decks already had a really tough time being behind early, and if you had to ever loot early, that was a nightmare. So now instead you can play this on 1. Trade it off if you need to, on turn 2 or 3 or whatever with an X1, or team up on a double block. And on turn 2, you can activate this and set it for your turn 3. And that's pretty important because turn 3 in the blue and the green decks, which are pretty key turns. They're turns that, you play your Myconid, you play your stabilizing defensive play, and being able to make sure you hit your land drop, being able to make sure you can find the right card for the right time. Having a window now that you don't feel bad looting on is really great for this card. This card also benefits from the fact that there's 3-mana rocks, a bunch of them we're going to get to in a bit, that got more playable. And so on turn 3, you can now play a mana rock and then play this 1-mana looter, and that does affect the board in some way. It's not just an enchantment. This a 1/2 will block if you needed to. Again, this also benefits from the format shifting a little bit to being a little bit slower, a little more about ramp decks, and you just caring a little bit more about having a looter because the games do grind a little bit more. And in a long game, looters are good. You can loot away extra lands when your opponent might be drawing lands. So I've been really impressed with this card. I've played multiples and not been too sad. There's always the joke about multiple Merfolk looters. If you draw multiple, you can just loot one away together. I've done that, and it's felt pretty good, and I've definitely won a lot of games I wouldn't have already because I turned through my lands when my opponent was drawing lands, and we were at a stalemate. So this card is a desirable effect. It was a desirable effect before. It's just that it was too clunky to use, and now we've kind of solved that problem. Oh, I also noted about the orbs, kind of playing well with the orbs. It's pretty nice to play the green orb, which is the one that gives something hexproof and a counter on turn 3, and then play Looter as a 2/3, because that is, it's a meaningful difference too, right? You can just block any amount of other things that a 1/2 couldn't block. Next up, we've got Young Blue Dragon. This is a pretty simple change. 5 mana, 3/4 flyer now instead of a 3/3, and it's still got the same Sand Augury, Adventurer, Scribe, 1 draw card. Nothing much to say other than this is just a very subtle buff, but it's a good buff. It means that it can block a lot more things than it could before. Like, you would be surprised. Like, again, going back to kind of an insight into game design here. Not that I'm an expert by any means. I'm just, here I'm repeating what I've heard from other very smart people in the industry. Often when you change a number on a card, a power, a toughness, a mana is a big one, but a power or a toughness, it can seem small but have really lasting impacts, really profound impacts. And this 3/4 now blocking pretty much everything your opponent could play before turn 4, with some exceptions, is a really big deal. Because when your 4 mana card had to trade down for like a 3/1, that was just really, really bad. So 3/4 coming down, blocking, really quite nice. Again, another winner from benefiting from the orbs, because if you can make this a 4/5 flyer with the green orb, really kind of nice. So another thumbs up addition to the blue roster here. You come to a river. So this one's interesting. This is 2 and a blue now instead of 1 and a blue for a sorcery instead of an instant. It's still got the mode of, target creature you control gets +1/+0 and unblockable. But the bounce mode, bounce a non-land permanent, has changed to the owner of target non-land permanent puts it on the top or bottom of the library. This card, it's not a clear buff, right? It is a side grade, maybe. I've already been in situations with this card where I wish that I could bounce my own thing, and you can no longer bounce your own thing. I've also been in situations where I wish it was an instant, but I've also been in situations where I've been really happy with this card because on turn 3, you can target a double team creature your opponent played, and that sets them back a turn, right? I mean, you could do that the same thing with the bounce spell, what this card was previously, but you're down a card at that point. I do think this is a good card, but I don't think it's a card that, compared to the last 2 cards, the Looter and the Blue Dragon, I'm not like, oh man, this makes blue so much better. I think it's an upgrade, and I'm more likely to put one of these in my deck, but it's not one of blue's better commons still. I will say, though, one of the things that blue had a problem with before is that sometimes you find yourself in situations where you kind of have the sense that your opponent might have an interaction spell, they might have a combat trick. If your plan for blocking a early creature, a good aggressive 2-drop or 3-drop is to, or your plan of dealing with it is to block, this does solve that problem, because instead of blocking, you think your opponent has a trick or a removal spell, you get blown out on the block, you can instead just choose to get the thing off the table, which is like a question you have to ask yourself a lot of the time when you're trying to stabilize in general. Like, do I want to try to block, or do I want to just cast my removal spell on that thing? And this now gives you that option where blue just didn't really have that option before. So that's kind of nice. I would say generally an upgrade, but not a giant one in my opinion. All right, next up we've got 2 cards that I don't think matter that much. So we've got Water Weird and Pseudo Dragon Familiar. So Water Weird is the 3/4 for 3 in a blue, so 4 mana. When it deals combat damage to a player, put a counter on the weird. If the top card of your library is a non-land, otherwise you mill a card. Weird card. The buff you got here is it now has the ability, 1 in a blue, Water Weird gets +1, -1 until end of turn. Yeah, I mean, this doesn't solve the problem with the card. The problem with the card was it was like a dorky 4 mana 3/4 that had a hit ability that didn't really matter. And I guess this can help you get in a little bit easier or threaten good attacks, but like a 3/4 already attacked pretty well. I guess you can, like, in the late game, threaten to go unblocked with a lot of damage, but, like, that's not what the blue decks are trying to do. They're not trying to, like, eke out damage necessarily. So, I don't think you're going to be putting this card in your deck any more than you did before. Pseudo Dragon Familiar is the 3 mana 2/2 flyer. Dragon has the ability, 3 mana, target creature gains flying until end of turn. It is now a 2/2 instead of a 2/1. Similar thing. I mean, it's nice that this doesn't get blocked by Pilgrim's Eye anymore, and it doesn't die to Shambling Ghast. But otherwise, it's like, yeah, like again, neither of these cards is really what the blue decks are doing. the blue decks are just trying to like survive and then win with big flyers in the air, you're not really trying to force through small creatures. So neither of these I care about very much. They are buffs, but not ones that affect the format, I don't think. More cards that I think don't affect the format even more so. So we've got Kenku Artificer, which is the 3-mana 1/3. It when it enters the battlefield, you put 3 +1/+1 counters on a non-creature artifact, and that creature becomes a 0/0 creature with flying, which, you know, of course, is a 3/3 flyer. And Goggles of Night, which is a 1 and a blue equipment that has equip 1. When the creature deals combat damage, you scry 1, then draw a card. More of the same here. I wasn't very interested in putting these cards in my deck before. I'm not that interested still. Kenku Artificer, again, just like the previous cards, it wasn't, like, the buff here, oh, I should say, so the Artificer is a 1/3, not a 1/1 anymore. The buff here doesn't solve the problem of the card. The problem of Artificer wasn't that it was too small or too dorky, it was just that you never have enough non-creature artifacts to really make this a real card in your deck. Similar to Goggles of Night, I mean, it does solve the problem a little bit of the card being, you know, hard to, you know, you have to, before you had to play it and then pay 2 to equip, and that was clunky. It's a little bit less clunky, but I still don't really feel like I need Goggles of Night in my deck to have a good blue deck. In fact, once again, my blue decks just aren't operating on this axis of attacking my opponents very often. Again, just not a bad changes to the format, I suppose. It's not bad to buff bad cards, but they're not buffed in a way that I think are going to meaningfully make these cards played more often. And then we've got these specialized blue creatures. So Val, Eager Scholar, which is the looter, and Allura, Rogue Companion, which is the 3/3 that when you attack, you can make something unblockable, and then that thing returns to your hand. So Val, I think, almost doesn't change at all. She got an extra point of toughness. That's her buff. I'm going to say it again. It's not the problem with the card. The problem with the card, it was not that it was a little bit too small, right? I'm still not going to be playing a 3-mana 2/2 looter in my deck. It can block 1-power creatures now, but whatever. Allura, similar thing. I'm maybe a little bit more excited about the Allura buff because 3/3 can block a lot more things than 3/2. And in some of my decks, I did consider playing Allura when I was like enter the battlefield heavy. I had a lot of good white enter the battlefield, maybe like Priests of Ancient Lore or green ones with Owlbears and stuff. But at the same time, I still can't see myself playing this card very often. So that's all the blue cards. Blue got some nice buffs, it did, but it also got a lot of buffs that I don't think matter, really. The blue cards have made their way into more of my decks than they had before. So that's definitely an upgrade from before. Next up, we've got Guildsworn Prowler. So this is the biggest debuff in my mind. So this is the 1 and a black 1/1 Death Touch. When it dies, if it wasn't blocking, draw a card. It was a 2/1. This completely changes the conceit of this card. Like the core conceit of what this card was doing. Unlike some of the other buffs or debuffs, where it was kind of like, okay, I see what the card was doing before, and now I kind of just switched around some numbers to make what it's doing a little bit better or a little bit easier to pull off / hard to pull off in the case of Unicorn and Hippogriff. This card goes from good aggressive black threat to defensive creature that I don't care about very much. It's kind of very similar to how Circle of the Land Druid got a gigantic upgrade by getting a point of power. This gets a gigantic downgrade by losing a point of power. Because now when you attack with this, your opponent just goes, okay, I'll take 1. And it's just not that big of a deal. So this is basically a card for your defensive black decks. And it's good if you've got sacrifice outlets, if you've got Deadly Disputes, Sepulchral Goals, still okay there. But a 2-mana 1/1 Death Touch is not a very exciting card. So, I don't know. I don't think this change honestly needed to happen. I don't think this was a problem card. It was a very good card, but I don't think it was like so problematic that it deserved to pretty much get nerfed into oblivion. But, you know, it is what it is. We live with it. It's still a card I'm going to play, especially in my green-black decks if I'm really defensive and grindy, like I was talking about with those attrition-y decks. But, yeah, not one I think you should take early anymore. Next up, we've got Manticore and Baleful Beholder. So Manticore has changed from a 4-mana 3/1 flyer, or sorry, 2/1 flyer into a 3/1 flyer. And Baleful Beholder is a 6-mana 7/5 now. This is the one that each opponent sacrifices an enchantment on, or your creatures gain menace. And Manticore is the flash flyer that kills something that was dealt damage. I already played these cards a decent amount before. Like, not that I was in love with them, but I would play Manticore if I had Shambling Ghasts and kind of some expendable creatures, and maybe I was a little bit light on interaction. And Baleful Beholder I would play if I like needed some top end in my black grindy deck. And so I'm happy about these buffs because now they're even more playable. Manticore in particular, being a 3-power flyer for 4, that's a pretty large upgrade. I'm much more happy to play this card. I don't think it's definitely in for this card. It's gonna make my deck every time, but it's just a little bit more likely to make my deck. And especially in those attrition-y green-black decks that I think are gonna emerge, it does play a nice role because you've got a lot of kind of like dorky creatures lying around that you don't mind putting in front of a big creature and the Manticore finishing it off. So it also means that it trades with Hippogriff in combat now, which is great, where you'd have to engineer a situation before to kill Hippogriff with Manticore. Don't have to do that. So I like this. Thumbs up on this one. Baleful Beholder giving an extra point of power, I don't think matters all that much, even though I like the card, but yeah. It is what it is. Eyes of the Beholder is now a 5-mana card instead of a 6-mana card for -11, -11. This changes from I will never play this card to I will consider it as a 23rd to 22nd card if I really need interaction or just need another card. Like, this wouldn't be the worst card to put in your deck of all time, but I'm not that excited about it. So it gives you, like, it's this weird card that if your black deck is struggling on playables, now you don't have that problem, or you can solve that problem a little bit easier. But black decks never really had that problem because the roster of commons is pretty deep. So I don't really know what this card in particular is aiming to solve, especially when black has other good removal spells. But, yeah, if you want it, if you want it, you have it. And I guess if you're playing best of 3, you get another clunky interaction spell if your opponent has a bomb you need to get rid of. Sigil of Merkle. So this is 1 in a black for the enchantment. It was 2 in a black. At the beginning of your combat, you mill a card. And if there are 4 more creature cards in your graveyard, you put a counter on target creature you control against Death Touch till end of turn. So this just got a mana shaved off of it. As much as I was talking about how the green-black grindy decks, I think, got a big buff overall, I think that this card still is not going to make my deck very often. The green-black grindy decks aren't really looking to, like, nickel and dime with some combat advantages. They're kind of looking to go big and grind and overwhelm your opponent with card advantage or large creatures. So while I could see this card being played as a way to fill your graveyard if you're super, super heavy on ways to get things back or you really cared about filling the graveyard, I guess. But it does it at such a slow rate that I still don't think I'm interested in it. Like, I'm just going to be playing the other self-mill cards if I want that effect. And if I don't have them, like, this probably isn't going to solve my problem. So, yeah, I still think I'm out on this. Like, it's just not it's not the kind of value you're looking for. Like, if you were in a black aggressive deck and that naturally filled its graveyard, sure, but that's just not what the cards in green-black lend themselves to. So, still not a card I'm interested in. Still gonna never pick this, I'm pretty sure. Some red cards that also got side grades here. So, Young Red Dragon, which is the 4-mana 3/1 flyer that has Bathe in Gold adventure, 1 in a red, make a treasure token. Young Red Dragon can now block, which is nice because can't block is one of the most horrendous lines of text on a Magic card, but it lost the point of toughness, which doesn't matter that much, honestly. Yeah, I mean, this card I was never a fan of. I guess I should have a PSA on this card where on 17 lands, it seems to be taken pretty highly. Like, the average taken up on this card is 4, pick 4 or pick 5, which is extremely high. I guess this is just people thinking this is an appealing looking card. I guess Dragon is an appealing type line. But this is a card I really, really never wanted to put in my deck for the reason I just said, that can't block is an offensive line of text. Now that it can block, I'm still not that interested in it. It kind of is in line with a lot of the cards I've been talking about where it's like, okay, now I could consider playing it. It wouldn't be horrendous, but I'm still not going to put it in my deck all that often. Once again, if you need that like 23rd, 22nd filler card, not embarrassing, not that big of an upgrade. And then the funniest upgrade, or the funniest nerf / buff, I guess it's a buff, but I don't know if it actually improves the card, is Dragonborn Immolator, which is the 3 mana, or sorry, 4 mana 2/4 that it used to pump for 1 in a red to give +1/+0. Now it pumps for 2 in a red to give +2/+0. So it's a bit more efficient if you do have a lot more mana, but also sometimes you just wanted to pump it once and then you played another creature like a 2-drop, and now you can't do that. And also the ability isn't that good anyways, so it's like, I don't know. I just find it funny. I just find it really funny. I think they could have done a lot better with this card. Like, I think they really could have just said 1 in a red gives +2/+0. You know, they that would not have made this card busted by any means. So, yeah, probably not going to be playing a lot of Dragonborn Emulators still. Finishing us off here, we've got the Orb Cycle. So this is the colored orbs that make mana for dragons. Well, make mana for any spell, but if you spend it on a dragon, they get an ability. And the buff on all of them is that they now make a mana of any color rather than the mana, of their respective color that you spent to cast it. And this is a reasonable upgrade. Like, it doesn't fundamentally change the cards. It just makes it so that if I'm looking for a ramp spell, I'm more likely to play it, because a lot of times if I'm in a ramp deck, I'm also in a deck that's splashing, and this now helps me splash. So these cards I will consider them more often. The green one, I will call out as a card that I was sometimes putting in my deck if I had a lot of Dread Linorms before the changes, because that's a real payoff. Being able to ramp into a Linorm, it's 1 bigger, and then it doesn't get hit by a sorcery speed removal spell. Like, that is a real thing, and this was a fine card. And I think the buff just makes it so that I am more likely to be able to put this card in my deck. I have played all of these so far, and they have felt fine. So really, it just greases the wheels a little bit. That's what these cards do. If you want them, if you're in the market for a ramp spell, go for it. If you've got dragons, even better. Not a, gigantic change by any means, but a welcome one, I will say. And the last cards here we've got are Lantern of Revealing, which is a very similar card to what we just talked about. 3 mana, tap, add a color of any mana. It's an artifact. It is now 3 to tap and look at the top card of your library. If it's land, put it on the battlefield. If not, you can put it on the bottom instead of 4 mana, which again is a subtle buff, but you do feel it in games at some point where you can still activate this and play a spell. Mostly this card got buffed by the fact that I think you're just going to want ramp a little more often than you did before. Like, I'm going to get to in a second, but I just think that so many more of my decks in this format are trying to go big now, are trying to cast 7-drops, 6-drops, are trying to lean into defense early and then just haymakers late, rather than get on board early. You have to get on board early. Make sure you're not dying early. There's a little bit of that still, of course, but it's not. It's been dialed back a little bit. So I am playing Lantern of Revealing more just because of the nature of the format, less because of the buff. So it got an implicit buff. And then Navigational Orb, 3 mana artifact, pay 1, tap, sack the orb. Look through your library for a basic land, 2 basic lands or a gate, and put 1 on the battlefield, 1 in your hand. I think this is just a worse version of the cards I just talked about. So if you need it, sure. I don't think you're going to need it because there's so many other options to ramp on 3, but it's a passable card now. That's all the cards. Let's just talk about quickly what I think this means for the format. So I've kind of touched on it as we've gone through these cards. Big picture, I just think that the green ramp decks are great now. I think that's the best thing to be doing. They've just gotten a lot of implicit buffs from the aggro decks being worse, and a lot of explicit buffs from the green cards getting better. So Understellar Myconid, which Sam Black actually put out a whole podcast episode on, and he called the best common in the set, this is before the nerfs, over Hippogriff and all the white cards, I think is even more true. If you were a buyer of that idea before, I think you should definitely be a buyer of that idea now. I think that Myconid just is exactly what you want in all of your games on turn 3, even against the other ramp decks. It lets you chump block a turn or 2 against a Herd Gorger if you're behind. So this is my top common now. I think this is going to be one of my most drafted cards. If you sort by the next 2 weeks, I'm sure I'm going to be drafting this card more than any other card if I can get my hands on them. And yeah, that just leads into my even bigger picture thoughts of color rankings. So I think The best color is green. I think green is not by far the best color, because I think white and black are still, in there in contention. But, yeah, but like I was saying, both explicit and implicit buffs, I'm a huge fan of. And just the format shifting a bit, where what green is looking to do is just a little bit more acceptable, right? So all of the big, gigantic creatures that I was already a fan of, the Herd Gorge, the Linarm, I think you should be taking those a little bit earlier still. Owlbear, I think gets a little bit better as well, because if you can guarantee a 3-drop mana accelerant every game, which I think you're going to be able to do more often because there's more acceptable ones to put in your deck now, you can cast it on turn 4 more often, and that's just a good thing to be doing. So yeah, that's my prediction going forward. As far as the other colors go, I think that black is still the second best color. And then it gets interesting. White and blue, I think it's still probably white as third, but blue is somewhere in the conversation with black and white, both because it got buffed, but also just like green, what it's doing in the format is a little more acceptable now. So like the problem with a lot of the blue cards before was that they were just too expensive, and even if some of them were pretty powerful, you just got overrun, and I don't think that's going to happen as much anymore. So I would not be surprised if the stats bear out in a way that blue now becomes the third or even second best color, because I do think in particular it pairs very well with green. I think green-blue might be one of the top decks going forward. I had a lot of green-blue decks that I felt very, very good. So look out for that. Like I was saying before, I think that small changes, like, if you hear me saying, oh, blue is one of the best colors now, but I also said not that much got changed in blue, goes back to the idea of small changes can really have big ripple effects. And it's not just the blue cards changing that make blue better. It's the color. It's the cards of other colors that make blue better. So look out for that. Don't be as afraid to draft blue cards. Oh, I also want to count out or shout out Air Cult Elemental as a card that I liked before, probably more than most people. This is the 2/5 flyer for 6 that bounces something when it comes in. I think that card's just going to be great now. I think just like I was talking about the other big green dummies, just being able to cast the card a little bit early, it's a really, really good stabilizer. And especially if you're going to be able to cast it on 5 more often, I'm really into it. It's a pretty reasonable foil to other people that are trying to go big and casting Herd Gorgers and Linarms, because they tap out for those. You tap out for your Air Cult Elemental. You get to bounce it. You're ahead on mana. They have to spend their whole turn. And it's good against the aggressive decks too. So yeah, big fan of that card. Bigger fan now. I'll play multiples. I think that's a card that you should be looking out for taking. Maybe you don't have to take them too early, because people probably won't be, they won't catch on just yet that the card's great now. But I've been happy with multiple copies. And then red, I suppose I should touch on that. I was not actually that big of a fan of red before the updates. I think that relative to the color's power, it was very overdrafted. I think that the color has some good cards at common, notably Dragonfire and Rabble Rouser. But past that, I'm not very excited about its commons and its uncommons either for the most part. And now that the format is going to change a little bit, and the defensive decks get some better tools, and some of the numbers are a bit changed on some of the cheap creatures, I'm even less excited about it. Like, one of the biggest things that I could say about red, one of the nicest things, is that Ganassi Rabble Rouser, the 1/3 double team creature, if you play that on 2, you got a lot of free wins from opponents that missed their 2-drop or stumbled and then didn't have good blocks later. But now that the numbers on the cheap green and blue creatures have changed a little bit, and the aggressive tools are just a little bit worse, you're going to have a good block on like a Rabble Rouser more often. So it's like, I just don't see a great reason to be in red all that often. Unless you have rares or it's just super open at the table. But again, that rounds back around to my problem of I think it's overdrafted for relative to its power. And I think that green, for example, and even blue a little bit, were a bit underdrafted relative to their power, and now get it even better. So that's all I have to say about the set. Thank you for watching, everybody. If this is again, a little bit of a mini episode, if Twitch chat has questions, I'd love to hear them, but I think I covered most of what there is to cover. So have at it, and we'll have a quick Q&A session here. What do I think about Frost Giants? Yeah, so this is the Rime Frost Giants. I like that card. Yeah, it's a lot of the stuff I was saying about Owlbear, where you're going to be more likely to have an Owlbear on 4 because there's good accelerants now that you want to play. They apply to Frost Giant. I liked that card before. It was a really good stabilizer, and I like it even more now. You already said this earlier, but can you talk about what you think Blue wants to do in this format? Yeah, for sure. So I think that in general, Blue is looking to play a long-ish game. Like, it's not looking to go to turn Infinity and grind them out as like a counterspell-based control deck. It's not that kind of Blue, but it's also not tempo you out with cheap creatures, cheap flyers kind of Blue. It's a little more of play some defensive stuff early, and maybe not even like purely defensive stuff. Like, I'm not talking defenders. I don't even think there are defenders in this set, but I'm not talking about like stuff that only blocks. I'm just talking about things that block reasonably well. Like, I don't know, even like a Clever Conjurer comes to mind. But especially if you're pairing it, when you're looking at your secondary color, a Shambling Ghast or a Priest of Ancient Lore or a Lifelinker, like, play stuff that keeps you alive early, and then your bigger blue cards, like the Blue Dragon, like Air Cult Elemental, like Rhinefield Frost Giant, or like rares, those will close out the game, but like in a timely fashion, right? So it's kind of like you're playing just a normal game of Baldur's Gate early on, just like most other decks. Maybe you play a ramp spell, that's part of it. But then your expensive creatures are pretty good, and they're going to be better than what most people are doing at that point in the game, like on turn 4 or turn 5. That's one of the things that is great about Blue, is that its expensive cards are quite good. And now you're going to be able to leverage that. So really, if I'm to put it succinctly, it's Blue is trying to leverage its expensive cards. It's trying to play the big expensive things, or again, maybe rares, and not die early, and then turn the corner pretty quick because those big expensive cards are pretty good at attacking. All right, not completely strategy related, but are you a fan of the trend of top or bottom on spells like Run Out of Town and You Come to a River? Like, strategically, I would prefer to play with the one that didn't give them an option. For the health of the game and good gameplay, I think it is good to let your opponent choose to put the card on the bottom. The reason they have changed that is because before, cards would just go to the top, and especially if you were missing land drops, that was really, really punishing. It just meant, like, you hear game designers talk a lot about how the draw step is, like, one of the most fundamentally important parts of a good game of Magic, because it's so exciting. You're like, oh, I don't know, maybe I'm going to draw out of this situation. I'm not sure what's going to happen, you know? Like, it's also just, like, really fun. And when you blank that, your opponent casts a spell on their turn that takes all the fun out of your draw step. That's a pretty bad, bad moment. So yeah, I think it's a good thing, but it's definitely worse than if they didn't have that option, you know? Are there changes the other changes I wish there were? I think actually for the most part that they did a good job of addressing things in a way that shakes up the format, but doesn't completely invalidate certain strategies. Like, they gave buffs where I think buffs were due, and especially the debuffs, aside from Guildsworn Prowler, which I think was kind of unwarranted, but I get what they were doing. The debuffs are pretty appropriate. The one thing I wish they did isn't necessarily like change some cards. I mean, I'm sure I could go through the file and be like, oh, I wish they changed this card, that card. I do wish that the cards they changed with a little more, like, not understanding, because I think understanding, like, is a bit presumptuous, because I'm sure it's not like they don't understand what they're doing. I wish there was a bit more intention, maybe, behind the changes. Like, they wanted to buff Pseudo Dragon Familiar, or the Dragon's deck, and they gave it a point of toughness, you know? Or they want to change Water Weird, and they gave it, like, the pump ability. Or there was a lot of cards I just talked about today where it's like, this is a change, but it doesn't fundamentally address what the problem of the card was. So I wish there was a little more of that. Again, it's a tough spot to be in, because they can't change the cards too much without feeling like completely different cards. So, like, I get that they're in a tough spot there, but I think in a perfect world, yeah, they changed a little, like, the cards that needed some fundamental changes, they changed them fundamentally a little more. They've got a lot of things to balance. They can't just address the limited players exclusively. I think it causes a lot of other problems if you change, the goggles into a completely different card that has nothing to do with what it was before. But yeah, I do wish that there was a little bit, some more tweaks that didn't just feel like, oh, that's a buff, but that doesn't really speak to what needed changing here. How do you feel red adds to the ramp strategy? I've had some success with the Barbarian Unexpected Windfall and a big mana deck with Verdant Rejuvenation and such. Yeah, I think Unexpected Windfall in particular is a really good tool for that kind of deck. I think my issue with it is that generally, if red is your secondary color for a ramp deck, a lot of cards you have to play in red just aren't very good for that kind of strategy. Like, it does have a few choice cards, like Dragon's Fire, Unexpected Windfall, that are at home in that strategy. But I would imagine that any of the other colors are a better pair for what you're trying to do in a green ramp deck. Like, they give you better attrition tools, better card advantage tools, better ramp tools for the most part. So it's like, I would be okay in that spot if I had the perfect draft where maybe I had some red bombs I wanted to play, and green was pretty open to the point that I didn't have to play that many red cards. But I don't think it's going to be a spot I find myself in that often. You've mostly talked about the proper valuations of cards and archetypes, but can you comment on the strategies in the first couple of days, given how others seem to be drafting? Like, can you get certain cards late now that you likely won't in a week when people figure things out? It's hard to predict that kind of stuff because, like, so generally formats take about a week to settle, right? Like, a new format comes out, a week and a half go by, and after a week and a half, card evaluations are about where they will lie for the rest of the format. This isn't quite a new format, so I don't know how quickly it will take for people to adjust, and I imagine the people that are still drafting this format are invested enough that they will adjust quicker than the people playing a normal, the beginning of a draft format would be. So I wouldn't try to like bank on trying to like sneakily wheel good cards necessarily. If anything, I guess maybe I would try to, like, some of the cards I talked about, like Air Cult Elemental, that I think was a card that was undervalued before. I think those biases might still carry over. Like, cards that didn't actually get changed, but got better because of the other cards changing. I think those kind of cards might fly under the radar a little bit. But I think overall, like, don't try to, like, game the system or anything. Like, don't try to next level yourself too hard. Just, like, take the good cards when you see them. Unless, like, trends emerge. You might notice some trends. But otherwise, I think the biggest edge to be gained is just, like, knowing the information up front, right? Just being ahead of the curve of anybody else who might not know what cards are good or are not so good anymore. All right, I'm gonna pack it up from there. So this turned into a little bit more of a regular episode than a mini episode. It's a little bit shorter, but I should know better. I thought this was gonna go like 20 minutes, but we're coming up to 40 minutes in the recording and an hour here on my stream. So hope you enjoyed. For those who are still drafting this format. As always, I want to shout out the Patreon once again. For anybody who likes the show and wants to support, check that out, Limit Level Ups at patreon.com. I will have a secondary episode sometime this week. It might be pushed a little bit further back to the middle or later next week. But it is a 100th episode of Limited Level Ups where, like I said, I do have something lined up already, trying to figure out the, what kind of fun, exciting way to celebrate 100 episodes. I haven't exactly figured out my exact plan, but it should be fun. I'm looking forward to it. And I guess I should say a little preemptive thank you for getting us to 100 episodes, everybody listening, and who got us here. I'm sure I'll gush about it on a future episode, on the next episode, but do want to say that, and I think I'll pack up from there. If you are listening, you can check out this video on the Limited Level Ups YouTube, which you can go subscribe to get the visuals for all of this. And if you're watching on YouTube, there is the Limited Level Ups podcast feed that you can find just by searching Limited Level Ups, or check the description. It's there in the description, along with the Discord, along with the Patreon, along with a lot of other links. So thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.